Get the insulin down any way you can. More insulin, more fat. Just that simple.
So do you think that eating more butter could fix insulin resistance?
It's fine. The good thing about butter is because it's a saturated fat, margarine was a terrible, terrible mistake.
Dr. Robert Lustig is the best-selling author, international speaker, and a world expert in metabolic health.
He is on a mission to change the world and fix chronic disease, and it starts with one thing: insulin.
Insulin resistance is at the corner that leads to all of these chronic metabolic diseases, whether it's heart disease, whether it's diabetes, whether it's cancer, and for that matter, also dementia. I happen to think that a fasting insulin is the single most important lab test that your doctor can get on you. They say, well, fasting insulin levels do not correlate with obesity. It correlates with metabolic health, and that's what you care about. We have to get the insulin down to solve this problem, period. And then the question, of course, is, well, how do you do that? 73% of the items in the American grocery store have been spiked with added sugar. The toxicity of one Coca-Cola equals the toxicity of 2 Diet Coca-Colas. So half as bad. The calories have nothing to do with it. That's why my hashtag is kill the calorie.
Is there any hidden signs or symptoms that somebody could say, I have insulin resistance, and they can visibly see it on their body?
Yes, there's one thing you can see. You see it on the back of the neck, and you see it in the underarms.
This episode features Dr. Robert Lustig, and he'll talk about the most chronic health problem that you most likely have. That is insulin resistance. And by the end of the episode, you'll know the exact signs to look out for, how to fix it without taking medications. Now, if you're learning from and enjoying these free episodes, please hit the subscribe button, because we know that food is medicine. And by the simple act of subscribing, you can help share the message to millions more people that need to hear the truth. And now for the episode with Dr. Robert Lustig. Dr. Robert Lustig, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Rena.
Now, you are one of the top experts that people look up to in understanding metabolic disease, and you've helped millions of people fix chronic conditions, even in children. And you say all of these chronic conditions come down to one thing. That thing is insulin resistance. So today, Dr. Lustig is going to share his 40 years of clinical experience. We're going to talk about, very simply, what is insulin resistance, the hidden signs that are lurking in your body that you might not even know, and the 5 types of fat that you need to eat to fix insulin resistance. So Dr. Lustig, my first question, when it comes to insulin resistance, somebody might be thinking, do I have it? How do I know? How likely is it that somebody has insulin resistance without even knowing it?
Actually, it's extremely likely. And it's likely for a bunch of reasons. First of all, 93% of Americans have at least one aspect of metabolic dysfunction. Only 7% of Americans are metabolically healthy. And the way you know you have metabolic dysfunction is if you have insulin resistance. So that means 93% of Americans have a fasting insulin that's above, I would say, 5 microunits per mil. And that confers some degree of metabolic dysfunction. Now, most people don't know whether they have insulin resistance, and the reason is because they haven't gotten a fasting insulin drawn by their doctor. They haven't known to ask, and the doctor hasn't known to do it. So the question is, why is that? I happen to think that a fasting insulin is the single most important lab test that your doctor can get on you. Yet, the insurance company won't pay for it. And the American Diabetes Association specifically admonishes doctors for drawing a fasting insulin. So, how can this be? How can I say it's the most important test, and the American Diabetes Association says, don't even draw it? How can that be? Well, because I'm right and they're wrong. But how come? That's the question. The American Diabetes Association says don't draw a fasting insulin on people for 2 reasons. And both of them, I think, are species. Okay. The first is they say that fasting insulin levels are not standardized across the different assay platforms that are available. And they're correct. That is true. There are a lot of different insulin assays. Some of them are cheap and some of them are expensive. And the problem is that the cheap assays, for the most part, which are radioimmunoassays or ELISAs, they will pick up competing substances in the assay. And there is one particular competing substance that is a big issue. The first, that substance is called proinsulin. Now, proinsulin is not a hormone. Proinsulin is a prohormone. It is the precursor to insulin. Your beta cell in your pancreas makes proinsulin, and then an enzyme in that pancreas called PC1, prohormone convertase 1, has to cleave a piece out of that proinsulin in order to make the mature insulin. Now, proinsulin has about 5% activity compared to the mature insulin. So you don't want to be releasing proinsulin. You want to be releasing insulin. Insulin binds to the insulin receptor much better than proinsulin. But the problem is that proinsulin binds in the assay. And so it can give you a fictitiously elevated level. That is true. So what? If it's high, it means your pancreas is overworking. So yes, it's true. It would be nice to be able to know what species you're measuring. I don't argue that. But if it's high, it means you have a problem. And it means you need some form of medical/dietary therapy to improve the situation. And as long as your doctor is using the same platform each time he draws the level on you, you can use those to look at before and after and make decisions on it. So I think their reason for saying don't draw it is wrong. I think it's specious. The second reason they say don't draw it is the following. They say, well, fasting insulin levels do not correlate with obesity. That is also true. It correlates with metabolic health, and that's what you care about, because there are plenty of thin people who are sick, and there are many fat people who are healthy. So your degree of obesity is only mildly related to your metabolic dysfunction. Yes, it is true that more obese people are sick than thin people. 80% of obese people are sick compared to 60% of thin people. But 60% of thin people are sick and they don't know it. They'd know it if they were obese, but they don't know it. And in fact, 20% of obese people are metabolically healthy. Well, they should know that too. And the only way to know that is to draw a fasting insulin. So I think on both counts, the American Diabetes Association has gotten it wrong. And I am desperately trying to, explain this conundrum to them so that maybe they'll get it in the future. But I have to tell you, it's been a really, really, tough road. It's like pulling teeth with them.
I think the more people I speak to, the more that they say, I cannot get a fasting insulin test. I've asked my doctor and they can't get it. But more and more people are understanding the role of insulin resistance in chronic disease. I think it's first good to understand and to discuss what is insulin resistance, what's happening in the body to cause this problem.
Right. So the simple answer is insulin resistance is when insulin doesn't do its job. That's insulin resistance. Now, what does that mean, insulin doesn't do its job? Now, normally insulin binds to the receptor on the surface of the cell and causes signal transduction within the cell to alter energy in uptake and also energy metabolism within that cell. Basically, what insulin says to the cell is, I got a lot of energy out here because the blood glucose is high, and I need you to take it up and get rid of it, store it, put it away for a rainy day. Insulin is your rainy day hormone. And when insulin works, when your insulin goes up, you take more energy from your bloodstream in the form of either glucose or fat, and you snarf it away into cells for storage. Insulin is the energy storage hormone. So, insulin shunts energy to fat. Insulin makes fat. More insulin, more fat. Just that simple. Okay? You can take that to the bank. That's everybody agrees with. Now, the problem is if you're fat and your insulin's high, why is your insulin high if it's not working? Right? I mean, why is your fat greater? Because it's not working. So you shouldn't be laying down fat. Well, that's what happens when you get to type 2 diabetes. So your insulin's high. Energy goes to fat. Your insulin's high. Energy goes to fat. So you get bigger, bigger, bigger until one day, finally, you can't make enough insulin for as big as you've gotten. And when that day comes, now you can't shunt the sugar to fat anymore, the energy to fat. Now the sugar or the energy stays in your blood, and now you have type 2 diabetes. So type 2 diabetes is sort of the end game of this process. But the process is going on way before to cause the energy storage in the first place. And I've learned from my clinical experience and from all the research I've done and from all the research that everyone else has done, that the only way to lose weight is to get insulin down. And that's true whether you do it with diet, and that's true whether you do it with drugs. And that's true whether you do it with surgery. Get the insulin down any way you can. That's the key to this whole story. Now, having said that, what is going on in the cell that makes it insulin resistant? Well, there we have a little bit of a question and a conundrum, because there are possibly 2 and maybe even 3 different ways that this insulin resistance occurs. Now, the first way is the way that has been documented by many, many investigators. In particular, I'll do a shout out to Dr. Jerry Shulman at Yale University, who's done an unbelievable job at categorizing the metabolic pathway by which glucose can lead to insulin resistance. And basically what happens is when glucose goes to muscle, the muscle should take it up and store it as glycogen. But at a certain point, the muscle can't make any more glycogen. And what happens is the muscle ends up taking the extra and turning it into fat. And now you have intramyocellular lipid. And then that sends a signal back to the liver saying those fats are a problem, and they get taken up by the liver, and now they cause liver insulin resistance. And when your liver's insulin resistant because of the fat, then your pancreas realizes your liver's sick, and then your pancreas has to make more insulin, and now you have higher insulin levels all over the body. And then that insulin works on arteries to cause vascular smooth muscle growth, which puts you at risk for heart attack. It causes various glands to grow, and that increases your risk for cancer. Okay, it changes, blood proteins to make your blood more coagulable, to increase your risk for heart disease, and eventually your pancreas will burn out from having to make so much insulin, and now you've got type 2 diabetes. So insulin resistance is at the corner, it's at the nidus. It's the seminal event that leads to all of these chronic metabolic diseases that go after it. So fixing the insulin resistance is essential for fixing all of these diseases, whether it's heart disease, whether it's diabetes, whether it's cancer, and for that matter, also dementia. We've learned that your brain gets insulin resistant. So that's pathway 1. And I don't take anything away from that. And I think that pathway 1 is very valid. And it is the way that obesity leads to insulin resistance, because when you're putting all of that glucose into muscle, you're also putting it into fat. And so the muscle, the intramyocellular lipid and the adiposity, go hand in hand. And they're being driven by the high insulin. Okay. But I think there's another way. In fact, I think there's two ways, but the same substrate that leads to insulin resistance via a shortcut that doesn't need the muscle to be an intermediate. And that is to attack the liver directly. So what attacks the liver directly? And the answer is, well, anything that's metabolized exclusively within the liver to generate too much energy. And there are two things that we as Americans are exposed to pretty consistently that generate liver fat and therefore insulin resistance at the level of the liver. And they are alcohol and fructose. And alcohol and fructose, for lack of a better analogy, are the same. The only difference between alcohol and fructose is that alcohol is used by the central nervous system and fructose is not used by the neurons, but is used by the astrocytes. So it doesn't cloud your judgment, but it gives you some brain fog anyway. It's just not as significant as alcohol. Okay? So fructose and alcohol are metabolized in the liver and also in the brain. And you end up with an increased amount of acetyl-CoA. And acetyl-CoA normally gets burned in the mitochondria. But when it's fructose, you basically overwhelm your ability to burn them in mitochondria. And it turns out that fructose, and alcohol for that matter, inhibit three enzymes that are necessary for normal mitochondrial function. It inhibits AMP kinase, which is the fuel gauge on the liver cell. It's the enzyme that tells the cell to make more mitochondria so you can generate more ATP, more energy inside the cell. It inhibits ACAD-L, acyl-CoA dehydrogenase long chain, which is an enzyme that cleaves fatty acids into two carbon fragments so that they can be burned in the liver. And finally, it inhibits CPT1, carnitine palmitoyl transferase 1, the enzyme which regenerates carnitine, and carnitine is the shuttle mechanism by which the fatty acids get into the mitochondria for burning in the first place. So each of those steps, the AMP kinase, the ACAD-L, and the CPT1, are necessary for normal energy metabolism in the liver. And fructose poisons them all. In particular, it poisons that AMP kinase. It actually kills it. It kills the enzyme. So you have to make a new one to take its place. And that takes time. And so the more fructose you consume, the more mitochondrial dysfunction you have. And when you have mitochondrial dysfunction, that signals the pancreas, hey, my mitochondria are not working. I need to take the edge off these mitochondria. I need to store. I need to divert. And so the pancreas has to make more insulin to drive the pathway for fat development and storage. And that's called de novo lipogenesis, DNL. And that's how you turn sugar into fat. It can be glucose into fat or fructose into fat, but fructose is a preferential lipogenic substrate. And fructose makes 7 times more fat than glucose does. In addition, not only does the fructose cause mitochondrial dysfunction, but we've shown that fructose increases the amount of a specific lipid in the liver called ceramides. Now, ceramides are, for the uninitiated, for the lay public, that's earwax. That's what ceramides are, earwax. Well, guess what? You have liver wax. Okay, you have liver ceramides. And we've shown that fructose ups the liver ceramides, and those liver ceramides are uniquely and specifically able to poison the entire energy metabolism system of the liver. So fructose probably works at 2 levels. It works at the mitochondrial level and it works at the ceramide level to generate liver insulin resistance. And then when your liver is insulin resistant, your pancreas has to make more insulin. And when your pancreas makes more insulin, that raises insulin levels all over the body, which you can determine with the fasting insulin level. And then you can know whether you've got a metabolic dysfunction or not. So that's how it works. And that's what's wrong. And that's why nobody knows. But we have to get the insulin down to solve this problem, period. And then the question, of course, is, well, how do you do that?
As Dr. Lustig mentions, both sugar and fructose cause insulin resistance, and a very easy way to fix it is to adopt a low-carb diet and increase your healthy fats. And that's exactly what Dr. Lustig is going to talk about later in the episode, the very simple solution. Now, as you drop the carbs, you might experience some side effects like headache, nausea, and fatigue. Now, all this is very normal, especially at the beginning. So adding in electrolytes, specifically sodium, potassium, and magnesium, is so important for proper brain and body function. And that is why I have Element as a sponsor of today's video. I personally like to use a high-quality supplement like Element because it has a science-backed mix of sodium, potassium, and magnesium without anything artificial and no preservatives. Now, Element has a wide variety of flavors to choose from, but I love the raw unflavored option every morning in my morning coffee, and my husband loves the watermelon salt and the chocolate salt, especially in winter. And right now, Element is offering this free sample pack on every order. So you're going to get 8 single servings of Element to try for free. So if you want this, just head to drinkelement.com/the Primal Podcast. I wanted to elaborate more about fructose and the other biggest causes of insulin resistance. But the main point that you're saying is that people don't know they have insulin resistance. They have to get their fasting insulin checked. I wanted to also ask about you, Dr. Lustig, because you are a neuroendocrinologist. You specialize in hormones and you've worked with children for most of your career. How did you become an expert then in metabolic health and insulin resistance and the food industry and everything that you have worked on?
Well, that's a very long story. I went where the data took me. That's basically the answer. So in college, I went to MIT 1973 to 1976, and I majored in nutritional biochemistry because I found it interesting. And then I went to medical school. And when I got to medical school, I had all this nutritional biochemistry knowledge. And the clinicians were all telling me, nah, none of that's important. This is how you take care of patients. And I believed them. I thought, oh, okay, well, they're the gurus. They're the ones, taking care of the patients. I guess, modern medicine has moved past this, nutritional biochemistry issue. And so I started, my academic career, and I went into sex differentiation of the brain instead of metabolism, in part because I realized that all the stuff I'd learned in college wasn't going to be of any use and nobody wanted to hear about it. And so I did that for the first 15 years of my career. But I always had this idea back in the back of my head about what causes obesity. And then I went to St. Jude Children's Research Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee, pediatric cancer hospital, in part because I'm a neuroendocrinologist and I'm interested in the hypothalamus and the pituitary and how it controls hormones. So what patients are better to study and to help than patients with brain tumors? And when I got to St. Jude, I had a stable of about 40 kids who had a brain tumor that was treated with surgery or radiation or chemotherapy. And prior to their tumor, they were perfectly normal weight for height. But because of either the tumor or the surgery or the radiation, they became massively obese. They went from, 100 pounds to 400 pounds in a very short period of time. Now, this form of obesity has been known since 1901. It was described by two of the giants in neurology, Babinski and Freilich. And it was called hypothalamic obesity because it was due to damage of the hypothalamus. And these kids clearly had it. And I had to do something for them. And so the question was, what do you do? And George Bray, the father of obesity research in America back in 1975, had taken 8 of these kids and admitted them to his clinical research center at Harbor UCLA Medical Center in Los Angeles, locked them up, threw away the key, and for 1 month fed them 500 calories per day. Now, if you're eating 500 calories per day, what should your weight do? Should go down. These kids, believe it or not, their weight went up because they would rather store it than burn it. Now, in 1994, we had, the medical profession, Jeff Friedman and Rudy Leibel, discovered this hormone that goes from fat cells to your brain called leptin. And I postulated at that point that these kids, because of the damage to their brain, they could not see their leptin, that they had leptin resistance. And because they had leptin resistance, their brain thought they were constantly starving. And so they would eat more to try to raise their leptin level, but the leptin still wouldn't work. And they would also exercise less and they would burn less because they're trying to conserve, because their body thinks they're starving. And so that it was a combination of both increased intake and decreased expenditure that led to their hypothalamic obesity. Okay? Now, I'm not a neurosurgeon. I can't fix a brain. So the question is, how did the brain tell the body to store, and how did the brain tell the body to not burn? Now, based on work that had been done in rats, where they put an electrode in the hypothalamus and buzzed to destroy the hypothalamus, these animals also became massively obese. But you could stop that from occurring by cutting the nerve from the brain to the pancreas, called the vagus nerve. So I postulated that that nerve was sending information from that dead brain to the pancreas, telling the pancreas, make more insulin to store more energy. Now, I can't cut a vagus nerve because I'm not a surgeon, but could I do something similar? Could I give them a drug that would inhibit insulin release at the level of the pancreas? Well, there's a drug that's available to do that. It's called octreotide. Okay, normally it's used to suppress growth hormone release, but it also suppresses insulin release. So we repurposed it, and we did a pilot trial in 8 kids with hypothalamic obesity. And lo and behold, they started losing weight. And their appetite went down a lot. But even more remarkable, they started exercising spontaneously. These were kids who sat on the couch, ate Doritos, and slept. Within 1 week, the parents would call me up on the phone. Dr. Lustig, something's happening. Okay, I've got my kid back. And the kids would say things like, this is the first time my head hasn't been in the clouds since the tumor. And this was happening before they'd lost any weight, just because we'd gotten their insulin down with the medicine. This was remarkable. And we ended up doing a double-blind placebo-controlled trial, and the same thing happened. I said, wow, this is really amazing. We have found a cause of this hypothalamic obesity and also a treatment. Wow. Okay. So then I asked the question, gee, that's great for these 8 kids, but what about all these other obese people out there? Could they have something similar? So we ended up doing a pilot trial in a bunch of adults who didn't have brain tumors. And we gave them the same drug, octreotide. And lo and behold, we did a study of 44 patients, pilot study. 8 out of the 44 lost weight and started exercising spontaneously. And when we looked at their insulin, we knocked their insulin down a lot. And what was interesting was the 36 who didn't respond, we didn't knock their insulin down at all. And it turned out that the 8 where we knocked the insulin down, they had a quick rise on a rapid fall. They were insulin sensitive. They were insulin hypersecretors, but insulin sensitive. The 36 who did not respond, their insulin went up slowly, reached a plateau, and then came down later on, much later on. They had insulin resistance. So what we realized was that we had identified a subgroup of adults with obesity that didn't have brain tumors but acted like they did, because their vagus nerve is telling their pancreas to put out too much insulin, and that the octreotide knocked that down, and they then were able to lose weight. So we had identified a subset of obesity that was due to insulin secretory kinetic problems that had a potential treatment. I was very excited about that. Interestingly, the drug company was not. And the reason they were not was not because it didn't work. It was because you had a screen. You had to do tests beforehand to figure out who would respond and who wouldn't. And they said, it's not a home run. It's a single. We're not interested. I said, really? But they were not interested. So then I asked the question, well, okay, those 8 out of the 44 did well, but the other 36 didn't. And clearly they were insulin resistant. What's wrong with them? What's different about them? And so that's when I got to sugar. That's what brought me to sugar. So it was 2006, and I was asked by the NIH to come to the NIH for a special gala celebration that they were having, the environmental toxicology group, the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. That's located in Research Triangle. They asked me to come to this meeting, and it was going to be a 2-day meeting. First day was going to be on successes, like lead poisoning and asthma and pollution. And the second day was going to be on new challenges, like obesity and metabolic syndrome and ADD and autism. So they asked me, what did I think was the environmental stimulus that was leading to obesity and metabolic syndrome? And I'm sure they thought I was going to pull out one of these chemicals, that's in the environment, like BPA or phthalates or PBDE or PFAS or, something that you could remove from the environment very easily. And I said, no, that's not what's going on. that does not explain this. Something else is going on. I said, all right, look, I'm a pediatrician. And I've watched kids get 2 diseases they've never had before. Type 2 diabetes and fatty liver disease. Okay. Kids never got those before. Now kids get them all the time. What's going on that's causing those 2 diseases? So I said, all right, well, type 2 diabetes and fatty liver disease. Those used to be the diseases of alcohol. Alcoholics got those diseases. They got fatty liver disease, right? They got cirrhosis. They got type 2 diabetes too. I said, but kids aren't drinking alcohol. Is there some chemical that's acting like alcohol? And so I pulled out my biochemistry textbook from 35 years earlier, and I went to the page on alcohol, and there it is, and there's how alcohol is metabolized. And I turned the page, and there's fructose. And I looked, and I went, wait a second. They're the same. They're metabolized the same way. And then I realized, yeah, that makes sense because, for alcohol, the yeast does the first step called glycolysis. And after that, the mitochondria take over. For fructose, we do our own glycolysis, not the yeast. We do it. But then the mitochondria take over. So basically, once you get past glycolysis, alcohol and fructose are the same. And so I put together a talk that said, I think the environmental stimulus for all this obesity and metabolic syndrome is sugar. And it's been put into all the food. And here's the data that shows that. And I put together all the pathways. And I gave this talk at the NIH. And the toxicologist practically tackled me. Oh my God, he's right. He's right. You have to tell everyone about this. And I've been talking about it ever since. And, the more data that comes out, the more clear what's going on is. And, I think sugar is sort of the big kahuna. There are other things that do it, but sugar's the one we could fix tomorrow.
Absolutely. I want to talk more about the biggest causes of insulin resistance. So you've mentioned sugar and fructose. I think people are going to be thinking, well, I don't eat high fructose corn syrup.
Well, yes, they do.
How?
Well, because they eat ultra-processed food. And that's what's in there. Okay? And it's not high fructose corn syrup. It's sucrose too. It's, table sugar, or it's, maple syrup, or cane, or agave, or honey. There are 5 caloric sweeteners, and all of them have the fructose molecule. So even if you don't consume high fructose corn syrup, by the way, no one consumes high fructose corn syrup. You can't even buy it in the store. Okay. It's an industrial compound. Okay. But food manufacturers use it to sweeten their foods, whether you know it or not. So, 73% of the items in the American grocery store have been spiked with added sugar. It accounts for 58% of the sugar in our diet is ultra-processed food. So if they say they don't do it, I would say, look again.
What do you think about orange juice, especially you working with children and you've seen obesity in children, fatty liver disease in children? Orange juice, is it healthy?
So oranges are healthy. Orange juice is not. Now, people say, well, orange juice, they're the same, right? No, they're not. They're not the same. What's different between oranges and orange juice? And the answer is the fiber. Turns out the fiber is the good part of the fruit. The juice is the bad part of the fruit. The juice is nature's way of getting you to eat your fiber. Well, what's good about fiber? I thought fiber was the stuff you threw in the garbage after you juiced the fruit. Your body doesn't even absorb the fiber. It stays in the gut. It's not even a nutrient. Oh, yes, it is. It is a nutrient. It's just not a nutrient for you. It's a nutrient for your microbiome. It's a nutrient for your bacteria. And it turns out when you don't feed your bacteria feed on you. So when you don't give them the fiber they need for their purposes, for their metabolism, they will strip the mucin layer right off your intestinal epithelial cells. And what that does is it causes GI inflammation, it causes irritable bowel syndrome, it causes inflammatory bowel disease, it causes leaky gut, which leads to systemic inflammation and insulin resistance, by the way. And also the fiber sequesters, it pulls the fructose and the glucose out of the lumen of the intestine. It binds it up so that it doesn't get across into the bloodstream as easily. It inhibits the absorption of glucose, fructose, sucrose. The fiber does. And so you need the fiber to do that so that you can keep your glucose excursion down, which keeps your insulin excursion down. And that's protecting your liver from the onslaught of all of this sugar that would normally get turned into fat. And if you turn the liver into the fructose into fat, now you've got insulin resistance, through this de novo lipogenesis. In addition, the fiber moves the food through the intestine faster, so you get the satiety signal sooner, so you end up eating less. And the fiber is the food for the bacteria. The bacteria turn that fiber into short-chain fatty acids like butyrate. Butyrate is anti-inflammatory, anti-Alzheimer's. Okay, and it keeps you from getting inflammatory bowel disease. So it turns out the fiber is the good part of the fruit, but the juice is fiberless because we threw the fiber in the garbage. So fruit is good, juice is bad.
What about diet soda and sodas? Diet soda and then soda, which one is worse?
Right. So the data, we didn't have the data for a long time, but we do now. So what I can say is the toxicity of one Coca-Cola equals the toxicity of 2 Diet Coca-Colas. So half as bad. Now, half as bad does not mean good. Half as bad means half as bad. And a lot of people say, well, no calories, no fructose, I can drink 10 of them. Well, now it's 5 times as bad. Okay. So why are diet sweeteners still bad if they have no calories and no fructose? Because it turns out they act in a different way on the intestine. So yes, it's true they're not sugar. Yes, it's true they're not calories. That's true. But they still do damage. So the first thing is the sweet taste triggers the brain to tell the pancreas to release more insulin. Okay? It's called the cephalic phase of insulin secretion. We've been talking about it with hypothalamic obesity. Okay? So you end up releasing more insulin just because of the sweet taste. And then the second thing is that several of the non-nutritive sweeteners, in particular aspartame and sucralose, they actually cause changes in the microbiome, changes in leaky gut that ultimately lead to systemic inflammation also. So you don't have to be fructose. You can have, diet sweeteners do it too. In addition, some diet sweeteners, the bulk diet sweeteners like the sugar alcohols, like, erythritol or xylitol or, sorbitol or, any of those tols. Okay. What they do is, yes, it's true, they don't get metabolized the same way, but they end up acting as osmolytes. They absorb, they cause more water in your intestine. And so that ends up leading to bloating and diarrhea, which also can lead to systemic inflammation. So, and erythritol and xylitol have now been shown to be linked to cardiovascular disease and cancer too. So even though they're not fructose, even though they're not calories, they're still a problem.
I want to ask you about calories, because people think that if they just reduce their calories, I'm going to lose weight, cure all my inflammation and disease.
Right. It's not about calories. Not about calories. So what is a calorie? A calorie is a unit of physics. Calorie is the amount of energy needed to raise 1 gram of water 1 degree centigrade. So it is a measure of heat. Okay. Now, anything that has stored energy has calories. But we really don't care about that. What we care about is whether those calories end up contributing to energy inside the cell. Okay, that's called ATP. So what we care about is ATP generation. So can something have calories but actually inhibit ATP generation? I've already told you fructose does that. So fructose has 4 calories per gram. So when you burn fructose or, sugar in a bomb calorimeter, it'll give you 4 calories per gram. Who cares? We're not bomb calorimeters. What we care about is how many ATP we're going to generate. And it turns out because fructose inhibits mitochondrial function, we're going to end up with less ATP than if we had burned glucose. So even though fructose has the same number of calories as glucose, it does not lead to the same level of ATP generation as glucose. In fact, fructose inhibits ATP generation. So therefore, a calorie is not a calorie. And you can have something that is the same number of calories, but ends up being either healthy for you or not healthy for you. Okay. Example, saturated fat and trans fats. Saturated fat is a component of membranes all over your body. It's a necessary component of your brain. Your brain is 60% fat and most of it is saturated fat. Conversely, trans fats are the devil incarnate. And the reason is because trans fats can't be metabolized because the trans double bond can't be broken by the enzymes in the body. Now, they're both 9 calories per gram. One will save your life, one will kill you. Okay, so it doesn't really matter how many calories something has. What matters is how it's metabolized and whether or not it generates ATP for burning or not. And what I can tell you is there are 3 things that were in food that were a problem. Okay? Sugar, trans fats, alcohol. Okay? Each of those have calories, and each of those actually inhibit ATP generation. Now, we know that alcohol and trans fats are bad, but everyone still thinks that sugar is just calories. I'm trying to explain to them the calories have nothing to do with it. That's why my hashtag is kill the calorie.
Okay. I want to ask you about the solution now, how to fix insulin resistance. If somebody's watching this and they're thinking, what am I going to do? What am I going to eat? What would be a way of eating that you would say for that person?
2 words. Real food. Real food. Real food has everything you need and nothing you don't. So what's real food? Real food is anything that came out of the ground or any animal that ate what came out of the ground. That's real food. Okay? If it visited a plant, if it has a logo that you recognize, that means it is ultra processed. And if it's ultra processed, that's the food to stay away from. Now, there are 4 things wrong with ultra processed food, in my opinion. Too much sugar, too little fiber, not enough omega-3s and micronutrients, and finally, emulsifiers to hold fat and water together. Now, you need all those things for ultra-processed food. You need the sugar to make it palatable. You need the lack of fiber to make it freezable. You need the omega-3s to give you a fishy taste, and they're expensive, so it will raise the price ridiculously high. The micronutrients are a problem also for the same reason. Micronutrients tend not to taste very good. They have some off notes because they can go rancid easily. And so ultra-processed food manufacturers don't want to put micronutrients in their food because it would limit their shelf life because they would go rancid quicker. And finally, emulsifiers. They have to hold the fat and water together somehow. Now, it just so happens that an emulsifier is a detergent. That's what holds fat and water together. Like the stuff you put in your clothes washer. It's Tide, okay, that you put in your clothes washer. All right? Well, you're putting that in your intestine. So what are you doing? You're actually chewing through the mucin layer and exposing your intestinal epithelium to the elements. And that's what leads to the inflammatory bowel disease and the irritable bowel syndrome and the leaky gut and the systemic inflammation.
That's so interesting because almond milk has emulsifiers and carrageenans in it.
Yes, it does.
I don't have almond milk, but I'm just saying for people that it might be a processed food because if it has and people think it's healthy.
Yep, I understand. So we have a lot of work to do. So my colleagues and I have actually made a computer program to help people navigate the grocery store so that you can buy only the stuff that's healthy for you based on your biochemical profile. So it is called Perfect, Perfakt. You can find it online at perfect.co, not com, perfect.co. And what it is it's based on the rules of metabolic health. It is not AI. It's a recommendation engine based on the rules of metabolic health. And what it will do is it will sift your entire grocery store to find those items that are good for you and leave out the ones that are bad for you based on your biochemical profile. So very easy to use, although we don't have a mobile app yet. We're working on that. It's actually harder to do this than you'd think. But as a computer program, we can basically shop the store for you, and you never have to actually walk into the store because once you've walked into the store, all bets are off.
Absolutely. I can leave a link to that in the show notes of this episode. A question for you relating to what to eat. What do you think about a higher fat approach or diet to fix insulin resistance?
So if it's a high fat, low carb approach, okay, so it doesn't have to be straight keto, high fat, low carb. Okay, what you're doing is you're suppressing the insulin. And if you're keeping the insulin down, that's the goal. And so I'm for that. But here's the problem with that approach. Not that there's anything wrong with that approach. That actually is the right approach. But here's what happens. People go on a high-fat, low-carb diet, and they're on it for a month. They're on it for 6 weeks. They're on it for 2 months. And what happens is the problem foods start sneaking back in. And because you don't have a biomarker of efficacy of your ability to actually modulate your diet, what you end up with is not a high-fat, low-carb diet. You end up on a high-fat, medium-carb diet because carb has made its way back into your diet because it is so ubiquitous. It is so ever-present. It is so pernicious. It's everywhere. If you eat out, you're not on a low-carb diet anymore. It's just that simple. Okay? Forget ketogenic. I mean, if you eat out, you're done. That's how bad it is. Okay? Because it's everywhere. And so virtually everyone who says they're on a low-carb diet, in fact, is not. So that's the problem. And if you're on a high-fat, medium-carb diet, that's actually worse than being on a low-fat diet.
So I wanted to ask about fats because you say that good mitochondria and reversing insulin resistance, it comes from having good fat. Doesn't matter if it's high fat. It doesn't matter the proportion.
So what are good fats? Well, so first of all, what are mitochondria? They're made of fat. The cristae, the structure of the mitochondria is fat. Okay. And in particular, it's 2 double bond fats. It is omega-3 fats. It is linolenic acid fats. Well, omega-3s are the hardest fats to find in the diet. Okay, that's what's in krill oil or in fish oil. And a lot of fish oil doesn't taste as good because the EPA, the eicosapentaenoic acid, smells and tastes like fish, and so it doesn't get put into very many foods because it gives it a fishy taste and smell, and no one's figured out how to fix that. Now you can use DHA, docosahexaenoic acid, and that's an omega-3. And that's necessary for neural structure. And you can get that from algal oil. And so you could add algal oil to something and then not get the fishy taste. But you're still missing something if you're not, taking in EPA. So this is a problem for the vegans because, they don't want to be taking in animal fats. And unfortunately, EPA and DHA are animal fats. There's no plant that makes EPA and DHA. Now, plants do make a different omega-3. They make ALA. They make alpha-linolenic acid. And alpha-linolenic acid is good. It's not like it's bad. It's good. Okay. It helps prevent cardiovascular disease. And that's good. I'm not, belittling that. But the conversion of ALA to EPA and DHA is extraordinarily low. So just because you're a vegan and you're taking in a lot of ALA actually doesn't solve your EPA and DHA problem.
So we can have wild salmon and wild caught seafood, and that is enough EPA, DHA, maybe a few times a week, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, the toxicologist will tell you, yeah, you got to watch out about the mercury. I think that's somewhat overplayed, particularly if it's wild. I think you'd be all right.
Okay, so it's all these things that we have to think about. Don't have farmed salmon or farmed fish. It's not good.
Yeah, farmed salmon's much worse.
So I was talking here about good fats that that help with the mitochondria, reverse insulin resistance. So you mentioned the omega-3 fatty acids. There's a few more here that you mentioned in another video that I want to talk about. It's important to incorporate 5 in total. The first was omega-3 fatty acids. What do you think about saturated fat?
Saturated fat is neither good nor bad. Saturated fat is neutral. Now, people gave saturated fat a bad name. Okay, and the reason was because of Ansel Keys. Yeah, but Ansel Keys cherry-picked his data. The fact of the matter is, saturated fat does raise your LDL. And high LDL is not good for you. But the question is, how bad for you is it? Now, it turns out there are 2 LDLs, not 1, 2. There's large buoyant LDL and there's small dense LDL. Large buoyant LDL is what saturated fat raises. Small dense LDL, saturated fat does not raise. Okay. What is large buoyant? Large buoyant is large. Okay. It's so large that it doesn't get under the surface of the endothelial cell in the artery. And it's buoyant. It gets carried along by laminar flow through the arteries. So these particles of large buoyant LDL have actually been shown not to be the driver of cardiovascular disease. Small dense is, because they're small, they can get under the surface, and because they're dense, they fall out of laminar flow, and so they can approach and approximate those endothelial cells. So what makes small dense LDL? That's the question, because that's what you want to avoid. And the answer is refined carbohydrate and particularly sugar. So the saturated fat issue, I think, has been way overplayed by the lipidologists. And I think they're coming back around now and realizing that this has actually caused a significant amount of problem and distrust in the science.
So, pertaining to saturated fat, if somebody was to eat butter in their diet, do you think that's okay?
It's fine.
And that's going to help with insulin resistance.
It's not going to hurt.
But if people have more of these good fats, and I think that you alluded to omega-3 fatty acids is the key.
Oh, omega-3 fatty acids will help insulin resistance. No ifs, ands, or buts. It will also help depression. Okay, because it will improve neural mitochondrial function. Because remember, those mitochondria are made of omega-3s.
So it's interesting because I think most people don't incorporate wild salmon and all this wild seafood into their lifestyle. Is an omega-3 supplement sufficient?
Remember, it's got to be wild. Okay, farms, so wild. So the question is, does the salmon make the omega-3s? And the answer is no. The salmon eat the omega-3s. The algae make the omega-3s. The salmon eat the algae, we eat the salmon. So we get our omega-3s third hand through the salmon. But farmed salmon eat corn, and that's high in omega-6s and not high in omega-3s. So just because you eat salmon doesn't actually mean you're getting omega-3s. Depends what kind and from where. And of course, that's a problem, off the coasts. And, it's also much more expensive to purchase wild salmon. This is a problem.
What about the next fat, monounsaturated fatty acid? Is that important? Is that going to fix insulin resistance?
Yes, it will. And so monounsaturated fatty acids are, the main one is oleic acid. And oleic acid is what's in olive oil. And olive oil is good for you. Okay, everyone will tell you olive oil is good for you. The only bad thing about olive oil is you can not heat it too high. Okay, so olive oil is meant to be consumed at room temperature, but a lot of people will saute and fry in olive oil. Okay, they should not. They should fry in something else. And the reason is because olive oil has the lowest smoking point of all the oils. And when you reach that smoking point, you've put enough energy across the double bond of the olive oil, monounsaturated. That's a double bond. Okay. And what it will do is just the heat alone will flip it. You will flip the double bond and you will turn a good cis unsaturated fat now into a trans fat. And now you got a problem. So you have to be a little bit more careful with olive oil in terms of the preparation.
But that is important to fix insulin resistance and chronic inflammation. Overall, healthy fats. The next one to incorporate is polyunsaturated fatty acids.
That's right. Polyunsaturated fatty acids are like canola oil and, rapeseed oil and a bunch of others. And I'm not telling you those are great. Those are better than some, but not as good as omega-3s and monounsaturates. Okay. But polyunsaturated fats, are good. And they also, some of them have a higher smoking point than olive oil, which is good. But the problem is if you put enough energy across those double bonds, and there are more double bonds because they're polyunsaturated, there's more than one double bond. Okay. You can flip those and turn those into trans fats as well. So you have to be a little careful. And also if you consume too many polyunsaturates, okay, it starts wreaking havoc with your immune system. Because your immune system needs those other fats to be able to engage in inflammation, properly.
Can I ask, so did you say that polyunsaturated fats is like canola oil?
Yeah, it's an N9. It's a polyunsaturated.
Isn't canola oil bad for you?
Well, it's not good for you.
So let's not have that then.
Well, it's the cheap, obvious, available fat. It's not the best. Actually, probably the best, oils to cook with are peanut oil, sesame oil, and avocado oil.
Okay, I have to ask you about this. Seed oils. Aren't they classed as seed oils? And there's this whole thing that seed oils causes insulin resistance?
Well, it depends on who you read on seed oils. So right now, seed oils are, having a resurgence. And there was just a documentary that just came out like 3 weeks ago from Chris Kanabi and Nina Teicholz and who's the farmer, Saladino, Paul Saladino, and Brittany Hamilton, surfer. Don't ask me why. Okay, and it's called what's it called? Fetali. That's what it's called, and it talks about the potential role of seed oils in chronic disease. And they might be right, and I'm not saying they're wrong, but all the data that they, provide within the documentary is all correlation, not causation. And I've had discussions with Chris Kanabi about this previously. And I said, I'm not saying you're wrong, Chris. He's an ophthalmologist, and he has equated seed oil consumption with acute macular degeneration. And he might be right, and I'm not saying he's wrong. Okay, but correlation is not causation. Just because seed oils have gone up and acute macular degeneration has gone up doesn't mean that the seed oils are the cause. Okay, we have to be a little bit more circumspect about the data and how it works, especially when it comes to nutrition. And what I can say is that this documentary about seed oils and chronic disease is woefully lacking in causation. And so I'm not prepared to tell you one way or the other that seed oils are or are not a problem today.
Okay, fair and well-balanced response. Again, focus on the fructose. All your research is correlating to the fructose. Sugar.
Well, no, it's not correlating. It's I've got causational data. That's why I can talk about it and be, quite vehement about it, is because we have causation for sugar and for diseases. Sugar and type 2 diabetes, sugar and cardiovascular disease, sugar and fatty liver disease, sugar and tooth decay. Okay, slam dunk causational data. We have correlational data for sugar and cancer and sugar and dementia, but we don't have causational data for those yet. Working on it, but not there yet. For seed oils, we don't have any of that.
Got it. So causation data, not correlation data. Apologies for the terminology mistake. But it's just the evidence is there for fructose and for sugar. Getting back to the fats. So we mentioned that omega-3, top fat that we need to have. Saturated fat is not good. It's not bad. But you can incorporate butter and all those different things. Monounsaturated fat, olive oil.
By the way, the good thing about butter is because it's a saturated fat, there's no double bond to flip.
So it's good for people to eat.
Well, it won't turn into trans fats, and that's the really bad one.
Okay. Like margarine. We don't want to have margarine. Anyone having margarine?
Right. No margarine. Margarine is poison. Margarine was a terrible, terrible mistake. The reason margarine caught on was because margarine lowers your LDL. That's true. But we've already talked about the fact that it's not the LDL that's the real problem. It depends which LDL. And it turns out margarine caused all sorts of other problems. And margarine actually promotes cardiovascular disease, having nothing to do with LDL.
Okay. I want to ask you about MCT oils. Does that help with lowering inflammation and fixing insulin resistance?
So it doesn't help fix insulin resistance. But what it does do is it is able to be more easily metabolized in the cell by the mitochondria. It is more easily brought to the rest of the body, so it doesn't have to be incorporated into large lipid particles which then go to the liver. And so you can metabolize medium chain much more easily. The problem is only when you add the medium chain to other fats as well, then you tend to overwhelm the liver, and you can end up with fatty liver on that basis as well. So it's okay to cook with coconut oil, and you'll see a lot of people who rave about coconut oil, and it's true if you're doing the coconut oil in isolation. But if you're adding the coconut oil to something else that has a high saturated fat content as well, then you can be a little bit. It can be a little bit of a problem. Like, for instance, macadamia nuts roasted in coconut oil. That's saturated fat and medium chain triglycerides at the same time.
So that was talking about fats. And as you said, omega-3 fatty acids, very, very important. There's also amino acids, protein. People need to eat enough protein. So a quick question for you.
Well, everyone's eating enough protein in America.
Yeah. That's why I didn't really want to talk about that one. I want to ask you about carbohydrates. Again, you got the glucose, you got the fructose, but the main question is, how much carbohydrates can one handle before the fat accumulates in the liver too much?
Well, different people, different amounts, and it also depends on your exercise capacity. So one thing exercise does is it increases the amount of AMP kinase, and that increases the amount of mitochondria. And if you have more mitochondria, then you're not going to end up overwhelming your mitochondrial capacity, and you'll end up burning all the way through to carbon dioxide and ATP. Example, Michael Phelps. Michael Phelps, in his heyday, he's retired, but in his heyday, when he was winning 23 gold medals, okay, he would consume 12,000 calories per day. 12,000 calories per day. That's a lot of calories, right? But when they actually measured his output, his voluntary energy expenditure, he was only expending 6,000 calories per day. So if you consume 12,000 and you voluntarily only expend 6,000, you should get fat. Well, he didn't get fat. So where'd the 6,000 go? He has so many mitochondria because he's Michael Phelps that even at rest, he was burning more ATP, burning more calories to ATP than any of us, could do in an entire day. That's what he was doing, right? Because he's Michael Phelps. So if you have that level of mitochondrial capacity, if you have that level of exercise threshold, okay, you can consume a whole lot more carbohydrate and not end up having a problem. And are there people who do that? Well, yeah. But, again, the mere mortals, they can't do that. So how much carbohydrate can you eat before you'll do that? Before you will end up diverting? Again, it depends what else you're eating. Okay. But, the short answer is once you're in the 200-gram carb range, it becomes an issue.
Okay. I want to ask you about fiber because there are people that do a carnivore diet, a ketogenic diet, and it seems like the elimination of the fiber fixes their inflammation. Can you explain perhaps what's going on there?
Well, it may be that they're fixing their inflammation in part because they're less insulin resistant. Okay, may not have anything to do with the fiber. The question is, does a ketogenic diet mean you can't have fiber? That's the question. Okay, I mean, if you're having a carnivore diet, you're not having fiber. But a ketogenic diet could have fiber. In fact, there's a paper in, I think it's the European Journal of Clinical Nutrition many years ago, basically showing how you can add all sorts of green vegetables to a ketogenic diet and still be on a ketogenic diet. So there's plenty of ways to get the fiber, plenty of ways to get the micronutrients, plenty of ways to still eat healthfully, even on a ketogenic diet. Now, if you're going to go carnivore, then you're not going to do that. So then the question is, are you missing something when you're on the carnivore diet? And the answer is we don't know. That's the short answer, is we don't know. Possibly, but we don't know that for sure. Okay. And the other question is, can you be on a vegan ketogenic diet? And the answer is yes, you can. Believe it or not, you can, but it's harder. I mean, a lot of avocados. I'm not for any of these diet fads. I'm for real food, is I think what makes the most sense.
I just wanted to ask that because, people, they're following different ways of eating. And it's just good to understand, if you say fiber, somebody's not having fiber, is it that's inherently bad, or is it not bad? Or as you said, we don't know.
So fiber is particularly good if you have metabolic syndrome. If you don't have metabolic syndrome, if you're one of the 7% in this country that's metabolically healthy, then maybe you don't need so much fiber because you're doing fine. And God knows it, I'm not for, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Okay. So I'm not going to tell you need fiber if you're doing fine. But a whole lot of people are not doing fine. And part of the reason they're not doing fine is because of the fiber. So they need it. All right. So the question is, can you get your fiber anyway? And the answer is, well, now you can. And, full disclosure, I am the chief medical officer and co-founder of a fiber company. And you can find it online. We are selling, and it is called, the company is called BioLumen. You can find it at biolumen.tech. And the product is called Munch Munch. I did not make this up. Okay. Some marketer made it up. Okay. I hate it, but it is the name. Munch Munch. And you can find it at munchmunch.shop. It's also on Amazon as well. And so we're doing direct to consumer. So what is this stuff? What is this Munch Munch? It is a microcellulose sponge, 7 microns in diameter. So the size of a red blood cell. So small, your tongue cannot detect it. Your tongue has a capacity to detect 12 microns, not 7. So you can add up to 10% of the weight of any food as this microcellulose sponge, and you don't even know it's there. So you can put it in any non-aqueous form factor. So dark chocolate, you can put it in bean dip, you can put it in microwave lasagna, you can put it in, ice cream, you can put it in all sorts of things. What it does, you swallow it, goes into your stomach. It's a sponge. It expands 70-fold over its original size. That'll give you somewhat of a feeling of fullness. And when it expands, the nooks and the crannies in the sponge become obvious. And impregnated in the nooks and the crannies are a set of proprietary hydrogels, soluble fiber. And those are specifically designed to sequester, soak up, absorb glucose, fructose, sucrose, simple starches. Available carbohydrate, so that you don't absorb it early on in the intestine. That keeps your glucose response lower, keeps your insulin response lower, protects your liver from the onslaught of all that sugar, and it moves the food through the intestine faster, so you get the satiety signal sooner. And it will the fiber will act, to support the microbiome, so you will increase microbial diversity. And it will offload all that sucrose later on for the bacteria's purposes. So even though you consumed it, you didn't absorb it, therefore you didn't get it. Okay. And the bacteria will turn the fiber into short-chain fatty acids like butyrate, which are anti-inflammatory and gut protective and Alzheimer's protective. And also the fiber will act like little scrubbies on the inside of the colon to get rid of colon cancer cells. So this fiber is a proprietary fiber. All of the components are food. So the FDA recognizes this as food, has not been chemically altered. It's just been assembled in a different way. So there's no one food that has all of the components, but there's nothing about any of the components that's not food. And what you can do is you can take this with your meal, and it will basically turn your processed food meal into a real food meal. We turn processed food into real food in the intestine.
So why don't people just eat real food?
Well, why don't they? You tell me.
I mean, that is a preferential thing if people just eat real food. There's so many layers as to why. What I've noticed is that it's mostly behavioral.
To some extent, some of it's convenience, some of it's taste, some of it's cost, some of it's behavioral. There are a lot of different reasons. But this, the bottom line is ultra processed food's not going away. As much as I'd like it to go away, as much as I rail against it, I'm a pragmatist. The fact of the matter is ultra processed food is not going away. And I'm not even sure we want it to go away because we have to feed 10 billion people by the year 2050. And we're not going to be able to because we don't have enough land and ocean. And what we're going to need is we're going to need to reduce food waste. Well, most of the food waste actually sits on the shelf. And one of the reasons for food waste is because there's fiber, because you can't freeze fiber. So ultra processed food's not going away. Here's a potential method for being able to mitigate the health harms, a harm reduction strategy for ultra-processed food.
Last question for you. I forgot to ask you this earlier. Is there anything like any hidden signs or symptoms that somebody could say, I have insulin resistance, and they can visibly see it on their body, inside or outside?
Yes, there's one thing you can see. Okay, you see it on the back of the neck, and you see it in the underarms. Okay. So what you'll notice if you have insulin resistance, you'll have increased insulin levels in your blood, and insulin will bind to the epidermal growth factor receptor on the skin. And what we'll do is it will cause a hyperpigmentation and a thickening and a ridging of the skin on the back of the neck, in the underarms, underneath the breast cleavage, in the groin, on the behind the knees. So this is called acanthosis nigricans. When I was a med student, the pathology textbook had one line on it. Okay. Now it is, in virtually every obese kid because they are insulin resistant and the insulin is driving this phenomenon. And also the other thing you can see are skin tags. So skin tags are another sign of insulin resistance. So if you have acanthosis nigricans or skin tags, your insulin levels are high.
And they should test their fasting insulin as well.
Well, of course they should.
Can we talk about optimal levels for fasting insulin?
Well, yes, we can talk about it. If you're a metabolically healthy specimen, your fasting insulin should be less than 5. In fact, it could be even less than 2. But anything less than 5 is just fine. If it's 5 to 10, you're still fine. If it's above 10, you're not fine. And if it's above 15, you're definitely not fine. And if it's any higher than 20, you need some work. You need something fast. Okay, whether it be a change in your diet, an institution of an exercise plan, or the institution of metformin would probably be a wise thing.
Absolutely. Dr. Lustig, thank you so much for your time. If people would like to find you more, where can they find you?
I'm easy to find. I've got a website, robertlustig.com. They can find me at UCSF, profiles.ucsf.edu. They can find me on Instagram. They can find me on Facebook.
Absolutely. Everything is going to be linked in the description of this episode. Thank you so much for your time. And I'm sure that we're going to see you very, very soon.
Very good. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining me today on this episode with Dr. Robert Lustig. Now, you can find the full show notes to this episode in the Primal Labs. There is a full guide about how to fix insulin resistance. Just go to the description of this video, click on how to fix insulin resistance, open that up, and you'll see all the information there, plus Dr. Lustig's books. Now, if you're learning from and enjoying these free episodes, please hit the subscribe button because that is an excellent zero-cost way to support this free health podcast. You can also find me on other social media accounts. I'm on Instagram and on X, formerly known as Twitter, under the name of the Primal Podcast. And finally, if you love this episode, you'll also enjoy another episode I did with Dr. Jason Fung. We spoke about the best way to get the best fasting results. Dr. Fung will talk about fasting, how to do it, and how to get results, especially when it comes to healing chronic disease and achieving weight loss. Finally, thank you for your interest in root cause healing, and I'll see you next week.